Hello and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, we are going to delve into two real-life, spine-chilling encounters with ghost dogs. Yes, ghost dogs, dogs that are ghosts. Man's best friend or woman's best friend that is now man or woman's best undead friend, as it were. And while some of these ghost dogs appear to be perfectly happy with their ghost lives, others become snarling, savage canines and are definitely not the kind of dog you want to pet and cuddle. And so we'll be looking at the two extremes on this episode. One account of a seemingly friendly ghost dog, and another account of a ghost dog that proves to be fatal. Yes, a fatal encounter with a ghost dog. And so, on that ominous note, to begin at the beginning. And I've spoken a lot about dogs on this podcast over the years, like you do, but up until now, I've spoken of them more in a mythological sense, a more legendary sense, creatures like the Cŵn Annwn, the Welsh hellhounds that emerged during the Wild Hunt and are mixed up in all manner of weird and wonderful tales. But the dogs on this episode are much more grounded in reality, you could say, and are much more recent. These sightings are not from some dusty old books of mythology. They were recorded in the 20th century, less than 100 years ago, and they are ghost dogs in the sense that, much like ghost humans, if that's the right way of putting it, ghost people, ghost folk, but much like ghost folk, these are the literal ghosts of dogs, spirits of dogs who have passed away. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing to do with legends or any of that stuff, simply the spirits of dogs who, it would appear, cannot rest easy. Although I say simply, clearly there's nothing simple about a dog that can seemingly come back from the dead in some floaty form of a ghost. But you know what I mean. Compared to some of the old myths and legends, this is much more simple, much more straightforward. And we are going to dive straight in to the first account to give you an example of one such dog. Now, this tale takes place in a particular Welsh valley, as it is described, a particular Welsh valley, which is one of those really frustrating ways of not telling us exactly where it took place. Now, this is usually done to hide the identities of those involved, not just to wind up podcasters in future centuries like me, but usually it's to protect the identities of those involved, although they are almost certainly dead now. If not, they are going to be 100+ years old, but to protect the identities of those involved. But we can still play detective and try to work out where this is, and perhaps one of the reasons they didn't want to be specific about where this is the rather unflattering way in which they describe the locals, noting that there still lingers in some parts of Wales, i.e. in this particular Welsh valley, there still lingers in some parts of Wales a breath of that atmosphere of fairyland and romance, which, to anybody possessing imagination, gives a particular value to ideas and beliefs that, in less inspiring surroundings, would be classed as unmixed superstition by people of common sense, which is a very poetic, rather flowery way of insulting a big bunch of people. What they are simply saying, again, I'm going to use that word too much in this episode, but what they are simply saying is that the people living in this valley are more superstitious, they have less common sense than the more advanced people living in the modern towns and cities because because of their surroundings, because they live in this beautiful, idyllic, it would seem, part of Wales. As a result, these people are more likely to believe in fairy tales, the atmosphere of fairyland, as they put it. And while it probably wasn't meant this way, to me personally, it makes it sound like a great place to live. Let's go and live in fairyland. Let's go and live in this enchanted place, this enchanted valley where all of the nonsense going on in these industrial towns and cities hasn't quite broken the spirit of the local folk. But whatever the reason, these kind of details can help us nowadays maybe locate and track down the place, because we are told that certainly a century ago it could make you believe in magical things that maybe other people in more disenchanted places just couldn't open their minds to, such as ghost dogs. And this particular story concerns a Mr. Blair, Blair, just like the former Prime Minister, or the Witch Project even. But it concerns a Mr. Blair who is from Scotland, or certainly of Scottish heritage. We are told that Mr. Blair was partly of Highland extraction, and therefore possessed something of the Celtic temperament, which again can be taken in different ways. I am assuming the assumption here is that as a fellow Celt, this man of Scottish origin might be as open to these superstitious ideas as the Welsh folk are, which, depending on how you want to interpret it, that could be seen as a dig at the Scottish as well as the Welsh, or maybe it's a compliment to the Scottish and the Welsh. I shall leave you, dear listener, make up your own minds on that one. But this Mr. Blair does go on a singular little adventure that befalls him while in Wales. And this is an adventure that people in those advanced towns and cities might think is a little bit unlikely. But to this man of Highland heritage, it did not seem to him at all far-fetched at the time, but rather one of the most appropriate and quite characteristic of the country. To him, this was a great example of the kind of things you encounter in Wales. So what exactly happened to Mr. Blair in this picturesque Welsh valley? Well, we are told that business obliged Mr. Blair to live some years in this particular Welsh valley, so he relocated to Wales because of work. And often, after dinner, in the summer, he would cross the river and walk up the opposite hill to a house called Wernddu. That's WERNDDHU, the way it's spelled here. Nowadays, it's more commonly two separate words, but a house called Wernddu, where some friends live and spend the evening with them. Now, I have no idea if this house is still there because I'm not entirely sure where there is. But this does add a few more clues. If you are following along and trying to play detective, at least we have a few more little landmarks that might help us pin down where this is. Now, sadly, the name Wernddu is slightly common in this part of the world. You can find places with names Wernddu all over Wales today. In the north, in the south, in the west, and probably in the east. I haven't checked, but if you are listening to this in the east of Wales and you live in Wernddu, please let me know so we can tick that one off the list as well. Or maybe if you live in one of these Werndus anywhere and you've seen a ghost dog, just to spoil what's coming up, then maybe that is the place. But wherever this house was, wherever this valley was, it was from Wernddu that a narrow, steep road led down to the bottom of the hill where it ended. And from this point, a grass lane led up in the direction of a farm. So, even more details here, even more descriptions of this unnamed valley. And this was the route that Mr. Blair would walk in the summer to spend an evening with friends. And it was in the twilight of a certain beautiful evening that Mr. Blair left Wernddu and started to walk home. Now, he had his dog with him, a spaniel, and just to clarify, that's a perfectly normal living breathing dog to the best of my knowledge. He did not own a ghost dog, otherwise this would be a very short story. Mr. Blair saw a ghost dog one day because he owned it. The end, it was his pet. But no, he had a living dog with him, a living spaniel, one of my favourite breeds. And as he descended the hill and reached the place from which the grass lane diverged, he noticed his dog, who was running in front, suddenly lie down and begin to whine, which is always a worrying sign. His dog, happily running along, suddenly lays down and whines on the grass. And then he saw the reason why. There was another dog, a big Scotch collie, gambolling, we're told, and playing around the spaniel. Though where it came from he could not imagine, and he was sure that no strange dog had followed him from Wern thee. So this dog, this collie, the most famous example of a collie I can think of is Lassie, although I don't think Lassie was a Scotch collie like this dog, or like this man in fact. There's a nice bit of synchronicity going on here, a Scottish person finding a Scotch breed of dog. It's like a German person in Wales finding a shepherd, which... Actually, no, that doesn't work at all, does it? Finding a shepherd is easy. There would have been shepherds all over the place, or certainly sheep all over the place. What I meant was a German finding a German shepherd, but that entire analogy has fallen apart, so let's just get back on with the story. And he could see his dog playing with another dog that looked a bit like Lassie, but not exactly. Although playing isn't quite the right word, this new dog, this Lassie dog, looked like it was playing. His dog, his spaniel, was on the ground whining. But as he walked up to the two animals, his own still whining and shivering, the other suddenly darted away and disappeared up the lane that led to the farm, much to the apparent relief of the spaniel, who immediately seemed to forget his fright and became quite lively again. So, a short and sweet encounter with Lassie. The man approached it, and off he or she dashed up the hill to the farm, and his spaniel was revived. It's amazing how quickly dogs can just bounce back. One moment they're cowering, terrified, and the next they're up and about like nothing's happened. Now, Blair continued his homeward way, wondering to whom that collie had belonged, as he did not remember having seen it anywhere about before. But the incident, slight though it was, in the grand scheme of things, this isn't the most important thing to ever happen to Mr. Blair, but somehow it made a decided impression on his mind, so much so that he could not forbear mentioning it the next day to his landlady, remarking that he supposed they must have got a new dog at Nant Gwyn, the farm to which the grass lane referred to eventually leads to. And if you have been playing detective, you will have noticed another clue there. The farm nearby was called Nant Gwyn. Again, not a very unique name in Wales. There's a few Nant Gwyns about the place, but it all adds up. It all helps paint a clearer picture. And Mrs. Morgan, who I am assuming is his landlady, I don't think she's been introduced, but Mrs. Morgan asked him what the dog was like. And when told, a bit like Lassie, of course, he didn't say that. I'm paraphrasing. There was no Lassie. This is before Lassie appeared on the big screen. But he described the dog, and she exclaimed, "Why, indeed, Mr. Blair, you must have seen the Nant Gwyn dog. You must have seen the Nant Gwyn dog." And, well, it was certainly a dog, and it certainly ran to Nant Gwyn. But nevertheless, who the heck is the Nant Gwyn dog? And to continue, she said, it was no creature of flesh and blood, which I am sure got his attention. It was no creature of flesh and blood, but an apparition which had appeared to other people at different times. And the story went that many years ago, a tramp had been found lying dead on the very spot where Blair had seen the collie. And it was always thought that the dog, when living, must have belonged to this tramp, and with the devotion characteristic of its kind, had continued faithful even after death. So even though the tramp had died, and presumably the dog has by this point as well, it was still acting in that faithful manner. It was still seemingly trying to get help for his master. And in a way, it's lucky I mentioned Lassie earlier, because it was half a joke, but this is very much what these dogs are known for. They are known to help people. It's not just some Hollywood stereotype where some kid gets stuck down a well and Lassie runs off. These dogs really do that, although I'm sure that kid would be terrified if a ghost dog came back to help him. But again, that's another tangent we don't need to go down right now. But these dogs are known for these characteristics, and it would appear not only in life but also in death. And in this case, not just its own death, the death of the tramp and the death of itself. And believe it or not, this is actually the happier of the two stories. It gets even worse in the next one. But before we move on, it does pose one final question. And that is, if the dog is still haunting the valley today, what about the tramp? Surely that has to be connected in some way, and surely that would be a more terrifying encounter. Never mind a ghostly lassie playing with your spaniel, a ghostly tramp surely would be even more scary. And what if you encountered the two of them together? Well, it's all very hypothetical, I'm afraid. I don't have any answers. This is where our story comes to an end, and this episode is dedicated to ghost dogs, not ghost tramps, I'm afraid. So let's move on to the next, even scarier account of a ghost dog. And while the ghost dog in this account does share many similarities with the lassie dog, it also has parallels with another folkloric, spooky phenomena that crops up again and again on this podcast. One of the most common sightings in Wales, a good old death omen. And our folklorist tells us that while most people will agree that there is something particularly unpleasant in the idea of a ghostly animal, though why it should be so is hard to explain, which I think is quite a presumptuous statement there. Maybe we should have a show of hands. Hold your hands up if you think there is something particularly unpleasant in the idea of a ghostly animal. Because, as we've just heard, I would argue a ghostly tramp is probably scarier than a ghostly lassie. But let's go with it for now. We are told there is something particularly unpleasant in the idea of a ghostly animal. And there is no doubt that the majority of us would prefer encountering a human rather than a four-footed revenant. Again, personally, I beg to differ, but as if to reinforce their point, they refer to the Cŵn Annwn, those Welsh hellhounds mythology that I mentioned earlier, and which I won't go into in too much detail because I have dedicated several episodes to those over the years if you'd like to go back and check them out. But with reference to the Cŵn Annwn, they say, to quote, "These fearsome creatures are said to hunt the souls of the departed, and generally only their mournful cry can be heard. Only their mournful cry can be heard. A sound to make one shudder and tremble." End of quote. And the big difference they're trying to highlight between these more mythological Cŵn Annwn and the more, in inverted commas, realistic ghost dogs is that the Cŵn Annwn traditionally are said to be heard rather than seen. But in the lassie example, it was seen and not heard. And further, to hear these mythological dogs is usually a sign of impending death. They work as a death omen, and again, this is how they differ from the ghost dogs, because as with our lassie example, again, this did not serve as a death omen. To the best of my knowledge, the Scotsman lived a very long, happy life afterwards. But what happens when these two varieties seemingly collide? What happens when these death omen characteristics of the Cŵn Annwn seem to merge with the more benign characteristics of a straightforward ghost dog? Well, occasionally, we are told, a stray hound is seen by some unlucky individual to whom the sight is sure to bring disaster or death. an old Celtic belief and most certainly superstition, but it recurs to one's mind in connection with the following story. So what they are telling us is, yes, these Cŵn Annwn dogs, these death omen dogs, maybe it's all superstition, maybe it's old Celtic belief as they put it. However, there are more recent reports of people encountering ghost dogs, and the effect appears to be the same. So regardless of how you want to dress this up, whatever you want to call them, if you want to call them ghost dogs, if you want to call them Cŵn Annwn, if you want to call them Fido or Pluto or a good boy or whatever else you might want to call a dog, regardless, the end is the same. And in this case, the end is death. And I probably should have put a spoiler alert in there, but like I said, the last story was the happier of the two. It's all downhill from here. And let's dive in to the second story. And this story concerns a certain Mrs. Hudson, we're told. A certain Mrs. Hudson who went to live near the small town of W something 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 in South Wales. Again, we have to play detective here, because all we have is the initial capital W and then a long line to indicate where a bunch of letters have been removed. So it starts with a W and it's in the south of Wales, so somewhere like Wrexham, but definitely not Wrexham, because that's in the north, so I don't know why I said it, but somewhere that isn't Wrexham in the south that starts with W, like Whitland maybe, somewhere like for the sake of this episode, let's pretend it's in Whitland, but it's definitely in somewhere that starts with a W in the south. And one day, not long after her arrival in Whitland, not Wrexham, she and a friend went for a walk along the high road near the town. And so, while its location is again a secret, we can already tell this place is much more urban. It doesn't have that rural feel, that fairyland valley feel of the last place. And on their way, they had to pass a quarry, which was reached by a gate and a path leading off the road. Just after the two ladies had passed the gate, Mrs. Hudson heard a sound of loud panting behind her. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. Loud panting behind her. It can only be one thing. Well, maybe her friend was just very thirsty, but I think you've listened to enough now to assume this might be a dog. And she stopped and looked back and saw a large black dog come running out of the quarry down the path towards the gate. So there's good and bad news here. The bad news, of course, is that a big, scary black dog has emerged and started running. The good news is it's not running directly towards them, it's running towards the gate. Whereupon she said to her friend, "I wonder whose dog that is, and what it was doing in the quarry." To which her friend, who was looking in exactly the same direction, said, "What dog? I don't see any dog." To which Mrs. Hudson impatiently replied, "That dog. Can't you see it? It's standing there looking at us." To which her friend replied once more, no, she could see nothing. So Mrs. Hudson, somewhat impatiently, turned and walked on in a huff. Well, it doesn't say in a huff, but I get the impression she'd walked on in a huff, feeling convinced the dog was there, and marvelling, absolutely gobsmacked, that her friend neither saw it or heard its panting breath. How on earth could she not see it? Well, soon afterwards, Mrs. Hudson bumped into her brother-in-law, who was an old resident of the neighbourhood, and she asked him who was the owner of a particularly large dog, and she described exactly where she had seen it. During which the brother was listening with what is described as a queer expression on his face, and he answered, "So you have seen that dog," which, frankly, is not only stating the obvious, but suggests that there is more to this story than it just being a dog. He said, "So you have seen that dog." Then he continues, "According to tradition, either you or your friend will die within 6 months. According to tradition, either you or your friend will die within 6 months because what you saw was the ghost dog. Adding that it has appeared to several other people before now and always forebodes death. Which, frankly, is about as blunt as you can be. That dog means death. And while we might not be in the idyllic fairyland rural areas anymore, it would appear some of these superstitions run deep. Possibly because there's some truth behind them. Certainly, this old inhabitant seems to think so. This fanciful idea, as it's described, that not only do ghost dogs exist, but they are omens of death. And Mrs. Hudson didn't really pay much attention to this at all. She considered it all to be superstitious rubbish. She was perfectly certain that what she had seen was simply a real animal, a real dog. No need for ghostly explanations for what she had seen with her own 2 eyes. And what's interesting here is that, as with the previous story, the person who has seen this supposed ghost dog is describing what appears to be a perfectly normal, healthy, living dog. I mean, a slightly scary one in the second story, but nevertheless, a healthy, living dog. There was nothing of the ghost about it. It wasn't floating around, it wasn't transparent, it wasn't disappearing through trees or doing any of that sort of uncanny apparition stuff. At least, not that these people reported. But 6 months later, again, you can probably see where this is going, but 6 months later, she recalled that explanation, the explanation she had dismissed as superstition. She recalled it with horror because 6 months from the date of that walk, her friend most unexpectedly died. And the curious point in this experience is, of course, we are told that the phantom dog was visible to only one of the friends and not the one for whom the warning was intended. Which of course means that if the warning is for you, you might not see it. So if you go walking around Whitland or Wrexham or any other W place in Wales, the world maybe if you go walking around Washington or Wellington or Wexford, wherever you might be in the world, if you are alone, you could be totally oblivious to the fact that a big black dog is panting and running all over the place, signalling that the end is nigh and you will be none the wiser. And on that cheerful note, we've reached the end of the second account, and we've reached the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, as mentioned, I've recorded lots and lots and lots of episodes about dogs over the years. The very first one was one of my very first episodes nearly 5 years ago now, was about the Gwyllgi. That's quite a popular episode, and it does tie in with Dylan Thomas and all these various strands of Welsh culture. And about the same time, I'm sure I did an episode about fairy dogs, or there's certainly an episode about fairies with fairy dogs included along the way. And of course, the Cŵn Annwn, who have been name-dropped a few times on this episode. I've recorded quite a few episodes about the Cŵn Annwn over the years as well. And I am sure I will record many more dog episodes in the future, and cat episodes too, just, in the interests of balance. Don't worry, cat lovers, I haven't forgotten the cats either. So if you haven't already, please consider pressing the subscribe button and you will never miss an episode ever. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can rate it, review it, and tell all your friends about it. And if you really enjoyed it and you'd like to support it and keep it going into the future, you can treat me to a coffee via my website, which is always very, very much appreciated and keeps this thing on the air. If you'd like more ghosts and folklore, you can follow me on social media. I'm on all the main platforms. And as well as this podcast, I've also written a number of books about similar, weird, and wonderful subjects, which are available from all good bookshops offline and on. And on that note, it just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Diolch and fawr iawn am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, if you do see a ghost dog, first of all, give it a quick poke to make sure it's not a real dog. And if it's definitely a ghost dog, well, you might want to send out a group message to all of your friends to make the most of the next 6 months because, well, just in case. Until next time, no star.